Hello, everybody. This is James Mills. I am going to be presenting using Microsoft Project to manage risk reserves, contingency plans, and risk mitigation. I hope you'll find this a useful topic. It's going to be kind of a practical presentation. First of all, I want to thank all the wonderful sponsors for hosting this virtual conference so that we can enjoy this time where we learn to use the tools of our craft just a little bit better. My name is James Mills Jr. I've been a PMP since 2005. I have a lot of experience in introducing new products. I also have an MBA and BS from Tennessee Technological University. Have worked at a lot of companies, introduced a lot of new products. I have provided my LinkedIn profile, email address, and mobile phone for those attending if there's any questions after the session. My areas of expertise are around improving PMOs, mentoring others in using the skills of project management better. Also, leading projects. I tend to get projects that are large or have a lot of political intrigue nowadays. So I do still lead projects along the way too, as well as trying to help people get better at the craft. Sometimes we wonder, risk is a really hard thing to manage. But actually, we manage it pretty well in our lives because we know what to do. We buckle up in our cars and to mitigate risk of injury in a car crash. We put plugs over receptacles to protect our children from electrical shock. We wear helmets on our motorcycles and our bicycles to protect against injury. We use smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors to protect ourselves in the event of a fire. We also will actually pay people with insurance companies to offset the risk for us, to take the risk on for a small fee. And we even have cars now that will actually sense an accident and brake for us, actually reducing the probability of an accident even happening. So we understand how to use it in our lives because we're accustomed to working through and seeing that and doing those things every day. But the question is, do we manage risk in our projects? And a lot of times we don't. It's not because we don't want to, it's because we're not sure what tools to use. So the agenda that I want to use for us to look at today is my screen actually sharing? I think it is. Yes, it is. Okay, the agenda I want to go over today is I want us to look at the terms that I'm going to be using. A lot of times our syntaxes are slightly different among companies that we're working for. So I want to make sure that we all use the same terms so that the things that I say are understood. I'm going to briefly introduce how to identify risk in general. It's very important that even though if we know how to use the tool of Microsoft Project better to manage project risk, it doesn't do us a lot of good if we're not good at identifying risk to begin with. And we will look at some Microsoft Project examples. We're going to look at a simple phase process. It's mainly for small teams, small projects. A more complex phase stage gate process, more for more complex projects where you want to learn more as time goes on before you mitigate. We'll also look at the complex, but add on top of it contingency planning. And that'll allow us to add the next layer of risk management. And finally, we're going to look at a hypothetical situation where we're actually a site contractor, where we're doing the landscaping and the excavating for a home site. And we'll look at a project and look through some of the mitigations and contingencies that we could have there and how to use them in Microsoft Project. Okay, terms we're going to be using. We're going to be using the term risk, of course. A risk is a possible event that the team has identified that may have a level of negative results if that event exhibits. So we've identified it as possible, and if it exhibits, we've identified the negative impact. Sometimes you'll hear people use the term negative risk, i.e. opportunities. We're not going to be using that terminology here. It's kind of outside of the scope of what we're talking about. It's kind of a bigger topic within risk management itself. Of course, we'll be using the term probability. Probability is just the estimated chance of a risk you've identified exhibiting. We'll talk about impact. Impact is what level of bad stuff is going to happen if this risk exhibits. A risk score is just the product of the probability and impact. It allows you to give a combined score so you can have a relative scale when you blend together. Okay, it has a high probability of happening, high impact. I really need to address this particular risk. Mitigation is an action you will take to either reduce probability or impact. And I purposely stressed will. A lot of times people will put down a mitigation and they go, well, it's on a watch list. We'll do something we have to. No, a mitigation is something we plan to do to reduce probability or reduce impact. Most of the time, reducing probability is what you're going to be doing. It's hard to reduce the impact in a risk situation. One of our examples from the first slide actually is a day-to-day example where we do have times where we reduce the impact, and that's with seatbelts. Seatbelts are actually don't reduce the probability of an accident happening, but it does reduce the severity of the injury afterwards. So it's one that actually, and it's a day-to-day example where we can impact, but it's rare. Contingency, it's something we're going to do based on a triggered event. So we make a plan to do something if we observe something else, and then we will react at that time. And then risk reserve, we use the contingencies that we've determined and use it to calculate the amount of time on our schedule that needs to be in reserve so that when we activate contingency plans, we will have something to burn down, something to track. Okay? Identifying risk is really important. Don't think of it as a one-time thing. Think of it as a continual process in projects and project management. Also, you need to focus on this session for schedule risk only, because risk can impact project cost, product cost, quality of product, forecasted volume. But in this session, we're going to be focused on delivery, i.e. the schedule impact. There'll be one or two where I show you an example where we add a milestone for a mitigation because it's an expense that is helping us to mitigate something. And that's kind of one example where we'll look at, here's how you can show project cost of a mitigation. The schedule risk also impacts product cost. A lot of times people forget that. They'll do a calculation, find out they've got project cost risk, but they won't take into consideration the risk reserve and the total risk reserve and actually use the loaded labor rate to make the additional project cost of that piece. So don't forget that schedule risk is and your risk reserve can impact your maximal project cost. Always use cross-functional teams. Very important that you look at it from a perspective of all functions. It's part of planning. It's part of the learning process. And also, if you're looking at adding risk management to your company, get with someone who is very proficient with risk management and have them help you to develop a risk breakdown structure. This is basically a brainstorming tool that helps you when you're trying to identify risk. You have examples, functions that have reactions, and also examples of risk where things could exhibit within certain conditions. It's a really good tool to use when you're trying to identify risk. All right. So in today's examples and the rest of the session will be in Microsoft Project and Excel. We're going to look at a simple risk register, which is in Excel. We're going to look at examples. We're going to have mitigations by phase, mitigations by task, and adding a contingency. And then we're going to be our excavators, site contractor who's working who's a subcontractor helping build a house. We'll use the risk register and show how to tie a few risks back to the schedule. And then we'll also tie contingencies back to the schedule as well. And we're going to look at how to calculate and use risk reserves. Okay? I will now switch over. No questions yet. First of all, let's look at a simple risk register. I developed it for this class. So you'll see that a risk register, you have a place where you identify risk. You also have items where you can do this is to track which line item in the schedule that this risk impacts. It's important to identify that, and I'll show you why in a moment. This is the probability. So that's 20%, 10%, 50%, 40%. So these are impact scores, 1 to 10. The higher the score, it goes from red, yellow, green based on a conditional formatting formula that I have in the background. It has a mitigation section. And notice that I have another section where another probability and impact score are done post-mitigation. You can also set up an estimated probability and impact, do your mitigation, and then measure your new score. That's a more advanced technique. I didn't put it in the risk register that we're using for the class, but it is good practice because it can identify how well you are predicting the impact of mitigations, and it's a good tool once you get a bit more mature using risk registers. This is going to be a yes, no, do you need contingency? For this example, the risk that I made up for the example, I said all of them needed a contingency plan. And we'll look at those in just a minute. And there's a trigger point, an identified trigger point. So once this trigger point is met, the contingency is activated. And we'll see how to activate it in just a moment. What we do in these are we go worst case, best, most likely, and best case, and then calculate it based on a formula of this times 4 of this plus this added together divided by 6. And it gives you the calculated value for use in your risk reserve calculation. Okay? So that is our simple risk register. Now let's look at a project. Got 4 examples in here. First of all, let's look at it just a simple project phase process. So this is a stage gate process. Sometimes it makes sense in a stage gate process to use mitigation early in the phase. You have a simple team. Am I muted? I think I have been muted.
We can hear you loud and clear, Jim.
Oh, you can? Okay.
We can.
I'm just making sure. All right. So at the beginning of your phase, if you have a small team, a not overly complex project, what you can do is get your team together, do all the mitigations in one step for all the mitigations for that phase, then proceed to your work packages, your tasks, etc. And that's a good practice for a simple process. Also, you can see no matter what process I use, I create a column for risk items, and I use a combo box custom field. All right, I'm going to have a lookup table, and I use no, it is not an item for risk. In other words, it's an actual task or a summary task. This is a mitigation, a contingency, or a reserve. What that allows me to do is if there's questions for stakeholders on, okay, exactly what impact is risk having on the schedule, I can quickly come in here and filter, say I can filter on mitigations and be able to show these mitigations are what's impacting the schedule. Okay, so it just allows me to quickly be able to show people what risk is doing to the schedule. Okay, so this is a really simple item. On this particular one, I didn't add any contingency plans because I was just mitigating. It was not complex enough, and the risks were not bad enough. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to do any contingencies. I'm going to accept what's ever left after I do my mitigation, and I reduce the probability of these things happening. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. And remember, that's for simple projects, small teams. Okay, here's another way of doing it. A more complex stage gate project. Okay, this mitigation item is for this task. So the mitigation item on 165 is for the task on 166. Okay, the mitigation item for 167 is for this one. And the reason this is better on more complex projects is because you learn things as you're developing. You learn things as you're going. So the mitigation that you have could be refined if you can put it later in the process. So you can see I've identified this one, but it's later instead of doing it all in the front of the phase. So if you have a complex project with a whole lot of functions involved, it's better to tie it directly to the task or the work package that it's going to impact if the risk exhibits. And that's the reason it's important on your risk register to have some way of identifying that schedule item that it's going to impact. Now, I did something that I don't advise people to do because it's a fairly simple example. I use the item numbers. When you add line items, those item numbers shift. I normally don't recommend people using those. I normally recommend some sort of work breakdown structure number, create a column for that, but I didn't do that for this particular example. But this allows me to identify what line items on the schedule are impacted by these risks. So I can quickly go there and find them. Okay? So you can see that, again, I used my mitigation risk line. These are the mitigations that are spread throughout the project. All right, there's more, but you can see they're not all at the beginning of the project phase. They're spread throughout. So as the project advances, we learn more information and we're able to attack things in a better way. So that means that we continually look back at our mitigation that we've determined and we refine it as time goes on. And then when we refine it as time goes on, we might be able to get an even larger bite out of probability, or maybe even a larger bite if it's that rare case where we can actually change the impact. Okay? So it gives us that opportunity to do the natural learning that happens in a project as time goes on. All right? So I want to show the last one, which is with contingency. And let me turn this on. Okay. So with a contingency plan, you keep the same pattern where you have your mitigation item. That's something you will do, that you're going to do. The contingency is something that you may do. And since it impacts this item, the contingency is going to be triggered somewhere in this time frame. So it's going to be discovered somewhere in this time frame. So what I tend to do is I'll put my mitigations just before the risk, my contingencies just after, and then in the taskbar, I will use the inactivate. Okay, so I'll put in the number of days that are in my risk register that was calculated. Okay, the calculated value based on the 146 divided by 6 rule, which is very common among people who are trying to make estimates based on worst case, most likely, and best case. It's a common formula that's used. It's nothing that's unique or anything like that. All right, and then what you do is if this is triggered, remember a contingency is it may happen, a mitigation is it will happen. If it's triggered, you activate it. Okay, I go back. So I go to the phase risk reserve where this is, I open it up, and I started with 10 days, it was 7.5. Okay, now gate 2 is 8.6 or 7.25. So now I need to take some days out of this risk reserve. And it's probably best to make your risk reserves fixed duration and leave them fixed duration as a item type instead of making it fixed work, because you're going to be taking time out of it. You're not going to be consuming the time like you would in a normal item where you have resources assigned to a line item. Okay, so I'm going to take 8 days out. Okay, and then that puts me back at the original 525. I put in my notes that now have 7 days. I also like to track the percentage that I've burned as far as time. So if I go 7/15, how many days I have, how much I have left, or how much I've burned. I've actually burned 8. So if I go 8 divided by 15, I've got 53%. So I've burned 53% of my risk reserve. If I look at that phase and I'm only 25% into it, I might be in trouble. And I can note to my stakeholders, we're still green as far as our duration. We believe we'll still make it, but the risk is higher than we want it to be because we've consumed more of our risk reserve early. And it's just a good measure that you can use on comparing risk reserve consumption to the amount of work packages that you've consumed in that phase. You can kind of get an idea of what side of the risk reserve you're going to fall, if you're going to consume it all, or if you're going to go over, or if you had a bad estimate on your risk reserve. But it's a good practice to do that. Okay? So that's how we use the risk reserve. We use the inactivate and activate. Okay? And we once we activate it, we take line items out of our either phase risk reserve, or sometimes it doesn't make sense to have phases. In our house example, we're just going to have one risk reserve that's at the end because of how the project is structured. It's not structured in quote unquote phases like you would expect in a traditional stage gate process. But you go to the one that makes sense for that particular one you've activated, and then you consume that time, make note of what you've consumed, and then compare it to the total burn on the phase or the project if it's a total project risk reserve. Okay? All right, now I'm going to go to our example, and I'm going to need you to use the chat window in order to be able to help me out with this. Because I'm going to show you what the 5 I've identified, and I'd like for us to identify one more so I can show you how you put these into a Microsoft project schedule. I've already put in some. All right, the first one I identified, I got with my team, and I determined that in this area of the country where we're building this house, sinkholes are a problem, and it could damage our foundation if we have a sinkhole problem. So we're going to use a geologist survey to help pick the lots. So if I look at the rough grade, is where I'm going to see it when I start doing my rough grade work. I'll be able to detect the sinkhole problem. So I'm going to mitigate by checking out the survey before I pick my lot. Because I'm early in the process, I'm going to pick a lot that has a low probability of having sinkholes based on a geologist survey of the area. Okay? So that's the action I'm going to do. I'm going to go to a geologist. I need a report on this area. What part of this site plan would you estimate has the lowest probability of sinkholes? That's the lot I'm going to buy. That's the lot where I'm going to try to build. Sometimes you can't avoid it, but if you can, then that's a way you can do it. Now, the contingency plan that I identified also here for the same line item. So this is saying I've mitigated this. I've mitigated this item by using a geologist survey, but this still could exhibit. The geologist survey could be wrong, out of date. Something could have happened where something was missed. So my contingency is I've got to fill the sinkhole. Okay. And the trigger is during my rough cut on the site. As far as starting my excavation, I discover the sinkhole. All right. And what I estimated was worst case scenario, it's going to cost me, actually I've got this backwards. It should be 10.5. Let me correct that. So it's 10.5. Let's change my risk reserve. That's okay. So 10.5 and 3 for those three. And that's the total impact of those on that. And then this will be a little bit off now since I found that error. You can see it was 8 days and now it's 5. Okay, we'll just leave it like it is now. But we only use this if we need to because it's triggered. So what happens if it's not triggered? You just leave it alone. Okay, don't bother with it if it's not triggered. And you can see that when you inactivate it, see this date, the predecessor is 29, and you can see that it goes right in and doesn't impact it at all. Okay, so you can see that there's no impact when you inactivate. It's almost like it's just not even there. But if you activate it, it impacts the schedule, and I'll activate and inactivate. Okay, and this one, same thing. You can see it shifts the schedule slightly. Okay, and then we use our risk reserve at the end. This time there's only one risk reserve now. There's not one for each phase. And as we activate these, we'll consume it on this side, and in our notes we'll keep up with how much we started with, what was our original job complete date, which was 12/5, and we use the duration going down as we activate contingency plans. Now you can also get this with your tracking Gantt, comparing to the baseline. You can also do that. I do this because it's a little bit faster for me when I'm trying to manage a lot of contingencies, and it's just a little bit faster if I just have that note in the actual work package or the in the risk reserve line. And again, risk reserve, it's better to use fixed duration as a type than it is to use fixed units or fixed work. Okay, so let's look through this and see if we can come up with a risk that's not been accounted for. So let's see. Let's say there's a political risk with the foundation certification. I've got problems with the county inspector that inspects foundations. There's a probability that I am going to get a fail on that. So there's kind of a political risk. And the reason I bring that up is because at times there's political risk within our projects too, and we have to manage those. Okay, so I'm going to go into our schedule. So I'm going to say the risk number 6 is due to relationship issues. May fail foundation inspection. All right. Wrap text. So schedule item, we'll just have to go back and look at that. It's only one, we can find it quickly. The probability, I'm gonna say this is really high. It's a 7%, but it's not gonna have a huge impact. It's gonna kind of be more of an aggravation than it is anything else, so make it a 2. But with a high probability in a 2, it does make it a yellow, kind of a yellow risk for us. So it's something we probably need to address. So somebody in the chat window, if you could kind of tell me some things that we could do to mitigate this. What can we do to mitigate? And probably want to work on the probability. What can we do to reduce the probability? About a one-on-one meeting with the person. And sometimes we got to do this in our projects. Sometimes we have a political risk out there and we need to address an issue with a person and resolve that so it doesn't exhibit in our projects. So I'm going to say that this is going to reduce it to a 3. It's still a probability 2. But that makes it a green. All right. And another thing that to make note, you don't have to have a contingency plan if you choose not to. If you know it's not going to be on your critical path, if you know there's a pretty good probability here, you're not required to have a contingency plan. As a matter of fact, what you want to do is you want to examine your critical path and make sure that the contingencies that you make are along that critical path. I happen to have done that in the other 5 that we did before the class to make sure that those items were on critical path. There's another method called holistic method that's a little more advanced where it doesn't have to be on critical path. And you use the same technique of activate and then consuming, but it's a little more complex and it's kind of outside the scope of what we're looking at here. This is called the situational approach to contingency planning. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this item as a mitigation item in my schedule. All right. So the foundation certification, before he has his certification, I'm going to meet with him. All right. That's probably going to cost me a day. And I look down here, 42 was the item. So I'm wanting this to precede this. So what I do is I just kind of shift my successors, predecessors like this. And you see it brings them into alignment. So now they're the same as they were before. Where now this one just precedes it. I like to format it for my eye because I'm really old and I can't see these sometimes if I don't do this. And also I want to make sure that I call it out as a mitigation. Okay. And now that's an action that we can resource just like any other action on our schedule. Because remember, a mitigation is something we will do. One of the worst practices I can possibly think of with risk is I've got it on a list and we're going to call it a watch list. Basically, that's like saying you've got a class 5 hurricane coming at your house and you live on the coast, and instead of putting plywood on your windows and over your doors and preparing for it, you're going to watch the hurricane. We don't watch hurricanes, we prepare for it, we react to it. So mitigation is what we want to do. We don't want it to be just actions on a list. We want it to happen. So we want to get it into our projects. Also, you may have a rail and where you have an item where you have a task on your schedule, but you have a rail that gives a little more detail. Sometimes people will put their mitigation items on the rail, and that's fine too, as long as it's on a list that drives behavior. And that's the key, is for it to drive behavior. Because if you're not driving behavior, you're not managing the risk, and we want to manage the risk. Okay. All right. That's all I had intended to cover today. I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. So are there any questions on the session? Let's see if we have any chats up here. Any of the attendees have a question? Okay, well, I guess we'll have a shortened session right now, unless there's anything else.
All right. So there is a question. Are you planning to make the files and docs available? Jim, are you okay with making your presentation downloadable?
Sure. I created something specifically for this session so that we have more complex tools that we use within our company that and this is a rudimentary Google level where you could find similar items on it. So yes, I can share these documents. I can share the Microsoft project file. I created it for this
All right,
session.
so send it over to us, and we will make
will.
it available on the site once the sessions are done.
That sounds great.
All right, and just a reminder for everybody, the session recordings will be available after 24 hours once we get a chance to process them, make sure everything looks good and all that. And so if there's nothing else, thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.